Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 26 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Every week gets a little better. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Please take a moment, pause, in fact, after I give you this URL, to support this podcast at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Pause. Unpause. Thank you so much for giving me all of your money. I appreciate it very much. The public hub, as always, is youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. My website is nickdimatteo.com, where I did put together a new podcast page. It's much easier to navigate, so please go check that out. It's nickdimatteo.com/podcast. And as always, please listen to and support my band REC, REC, at recarea.bandcamp.com or wherever you stream music. Let's get to this week's topic. I have to say, I've been putting this one off for a while because it felt kind of daunting to me, but some things kind of happened in this week to help me decide that this was the right thing to do. So that's where we are. And the topic is neo soul. Old, got new, got old, got now. And of course, as always, usually I'll explain that subtitle. So first of all, if you don't know what neo soul is, it is a movement that kicked off in around the mid-90s, sort of with D'Angelo's album Brown Sugar, that's often named as the first official neo soul album, but whatever. It has also been called progressive soul or alt R&B. And what it is soul music taking its cue very heavily from 1970s soul, infused with a hip-hop aesthetic and a 90s aesthetic and an early 2000s aesthetic and beyond. It incorporates funk, gospel, African music, jazz, conscious themes lyrically are preferred over the usual themes, although there are plenty, of songs of all kinds, of all topics and all of that. It's pretty broad, as is the style within neo soul, which is always awesome. And it's pretty much the case with every genre. That's why music is really not a genre. And it prefers organic instruments over processed sounds, over electronic, although it does incorporate some of that as well. It was considered a reset from the highly processed pop soul that had happened primarily in the charts, at least, before that. So if you're thinking about soul music in the 80s, most of it, soul music in the early 90s, most of it, again, was very heavily synthesized, processed. I call it the babyface aesthetic. And that's not a dig. There was a lot of that music that I loved, and that was wonderful music. Babyface making a big comeback, so, nice indication there. It's just that was a change. Artists started to think, and even before this, and we'll talk about that a little bit, what if we went back to the more organic, kind of warm sound instead of that brighter, processed, tinnier sound that you would get in the 80s and the early 90s. And that's because, like with any genre, subgenre, or whatever, the next thing that comes along is a response to what came before. It is considered a corrective in some ways. It can be over-corrective. It's considered, people might be artists, might be listeners, get tired of hearing the same thing, so other artists come along who switch it up. That's how music evolves. And the other thing to mention here with neo soul is that it is one of the, I think, main genres in all of music that, and I have to qualify how I say this, that from the get-go, women were not just essential to it, but central to it. And prominently, they were pretty well known from the beginning as well. And the qualification there is, in all forms of music, women have been at the beginning. there were, female like R&B, rhythm and blues artists in the 1940s and 50s that helped to establish what rock and roll would become. There were female rappers in the mid-late 70s who were some of the first rappers ever in history, and on and on and on. Doesn't matter what kind of music you mention, but it was well known at the time and throughout this that right during the era of the Lilith Fair and all of that, and Riot Girls, and really in a decade when women were not just actively involved as they'd always have been, but were really making themselves known and saying, we won't just stay in the background or have our, contributions co-opted or, shoved aside. And when we get into who some of these neo-soul artists are, you'll see how and why that was just such an important part of it. That even commercially, they came out equally as strong as the men. And that, sadly, does not always happen. So where did it come from? What were the influences? I think that's the first thing to say is this. You can talk about soul music in the type of that we are, say, starting in the 60s, precursors earlier than that, but it really took shape and became what we know of as soul in the 1970s. And to me, I love tracking it based on Smokey Robinson's career. When you think about it, because every change that happened to him from the early 60s straight through to the 80s mapped what was happening in kind of soul and R&B music. He's at the forefront of Motown, and he's still my favorite, Motown artist. When that came to the first wave of that came to an end, and he broke up the Miracles and went solo, he went into kind of his Quiet Storm phase and did all of his solo stuff in the 70s that was equally incredible in a different way, and helped to really define, like so many other artists of the era, what soul is and was. And then in the 80s, had a couple of hits where he had that sort of, more processed kind of, again, tinny or kind of trebly sound that you associate with almost all of 80s music, but it's, and in this case, the soul music of the 80s. Absolutely. Some other artists of the 70s who were templates for neo-soul. Original wave of like serious soul musicians. Stevie Wonder, of course, Marvin Gaye, Barry White a little later on, Isaac Hayes, Curtis Mayfield, Sly, the Family Stone, P-Funk, George Clinton. You had Roberta Flack. You had, in her own jazzy way, Nina Simone. You had later on like, Teddy Pendergrass and Donny Hathaway and Bill Withers, Al Green, and Gladys Knight, one of my favorites. And of course, they all did things other than that to a certain degree. But when you think of soul, you very often think of these artists and hundreds of others, of course. Interestingly, Bobby Caldwell just died as of the recording of this. And, it's this big thing in the news that a lot of people thought he was black when he came out, but he's actually white. And again, it shows you that music and labels in general, genre labels, whatever, people labels. If the music is good, it's good. People, are welcome to do whatever kind of music they love, as long as, and especially if they give credit to where it came from. Then what happened was, of course, that kind of soul music got old or whatever, and the music industry moved on and the listeners moved on, and you come into the 80s, and it got that trebly sound, and there wasn't a lot of just straight up soul that was very popular in the 80s. There was, but not quite as much in the charts. But you still had artists, especially getting into the late 80s, who were really dipping into that soul well, reminding people that, hey, it hasn't been that long since it was hugely popular, and it's incredible music, and we should all be, bow to it and love it again. Prince, huge one. Anita Baker, Terrence Trent D'Arby. I mean, these are like pre-neo soul people who were basically doing neo soul, in various ways. Soul to Soul, the collective from Britain. The brand new heavies here, and this is where I'm going to get out my, some of these, if I can do it without knocking them down. The diorama. You listeners out there, again, you're missing some real pyrotechnics here, me turning and picking CDs. The brand new heavies in the early 90s were one of my absolute favorite bands. And yeah, they had a dancier quality, they had horns, whatever. But to me, they were hearkening back to an older age at a time where not a lot of that was happening yet. So they kind of were at the forefront. You could say a band like Jamiroquai, you know, you could say, of course, Lenny Kravitz in Ain't Over Till It's Over is basically one of the greatest soul songs ever, you know, recorded. And that was done in like the mid 90s. And you can, and of course, like I said, Prince. And I picked Diamonds and Pearls out because it was of that era. And when you think of the song Diamonds and Pearls, isn't that just pre-neo soul in a lot of ways? And then you had Lisa Stansfield and Tony, Michelle and Deocello, and even, you know, to a certain degree, Nena Cherry, and hip hop acts of that pre-neo soul era, like De La Soul. There you go, right in the name. A Tribe Called Quest, Diggable Planets, Arrested Development had those jazz and African influences and organic instruments woven in, even at the time, and they're going to become hugely important in a second. The Roots had started in the late 80s and had started putting out stuff in the early mid 90s, and were, of course, all organic instruments. And so, you know, they should be mentioned here, but mentioned even more a little bit coming up. So even though the kind of organic soul music with the influences I mentioned wasn't a huge thing in the late 80s, early 90s, it was there. And these are some of the standout artists who did that. And it's just some people, and I mean, Soul to Soul was, again, I have the cassette. It's one of my favorite acts of the time. You know, and I mentioned some of the influential hip hop acts at the time and how they were different from the hip hop that had come in the 80s. And that kind of conscious hip hop would continue on, but not in the same style as the bands like De La Soul and the Tribe Called Quest did in the late 80s, early 90s. But I mentioned them because, again, hip hop is a big part of all of this, and it's going to come back as I talk about the actual era of neo soul, which I'm going to do right now. And much of it, many of these artists, really two things. One, were working with or somehow associated with this group, the Soulquarians, which was founded in part by Questlove of the Roots. And when I get to this next stack of CDs, you'll see one of those in there, even though I did, at the beginning of this season, an entire episode on the Roots. There's no reason why they shouldn't come back again and again. Questlove being at the Oscars and just being a hugely influential person in so many ways on commercials and everything these days. You know, I wouldn't have known back in the late 90s that that's where things, you know, would have gone. And honestly, somebody like him and the Roots and Black Thought and all that, no idea where it's going to go next. And that's a great thing. But Soulquarians, Jay Dilla, the late great Jay Dilla, James Poyser, D'Angelo, and the bassist Pino Palladino were really central to the Soulquarians and to that sound. And there's a second element here, which I'm going to save, that is again common among almost all of these neo soul artists. But let's get to some of the other neo soul artists. So we talked about D'Angelo and Brown Sugar. I'm going to pull this out now so we can start talking about the stack here. And this album here, Voodoo, is to me, and according, I guess I read again after I thought of this, other people, the pinnacle of neo soul. It's an album from 2000, early 2000, that has stayed with me so much throughout the years. It has actually influenced in some of what I do. I'm not strictly a soul artist, but there are certain things I do that do have influences from that, and especially from this album, that kind of murky, dark, low harmonies, and just it hits you in your entire torso, and it's just incredible. You're thrust into a world. And I remember the first time I heard this, I hadn't moved to New York yet, and I was on my way up here for an audition, and I was listening to it in the car, and it just took me like, I don't even remember the trip. All I remember is the music, you know. So yes, D'Angelo, huge. And then you have, and I'm not sure which ones of these I actually have, but yes, you've got Erykah Badu, and this is Mama's Gun. It wasn't her first one, but it was my favorite and an awesome one. This was sort of, again, at that peak of early 2000s, even though neo-soul had been around for a while. And then, yeah, of course, Lauryn Hill, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. You have a guy named MxG or Music Soul Child from Philly, and to keep that in mind as we get to the end of this list. You have a guy named, which one is this? This is Chocolate Genius. Headphone Masterpiece, freaking awesome. You had Cody Chestnut, not Headphone Masterpiece. This Chocolate Genius is, I don't remember. Oh, God Music. Yeah, sorry. I saw the headphones and I got confused. Headphone Masterpiece is by Cody Chestnut, who will come up again later as well. And then you've got The Roots. So huge, right? And Questlove played on a lot of D'Angelo's album. He may have even played on the first one. I didn't look that up. He played on so many others, and so those other Soulquarians did. Before I get too far ahead, let's name some other prominent neo-soul artists. Maxwell is a huge one, right there at the forefront. Macy Gray, Angie Stone, Jill Scott, India Ari. I mean, again, so many women, and Bilal. And one of the things that a lot of those artists have in common is not just the Soulquarians, it's the Philly connection. And it's no accident. I mean, if anybody knows anything about music history would know that Philly Soul, Philly International, and all of that, soul music, you know, and Philly are inextricably linked. They're intertwined in a way that they can never be, you know, untwined to this day. And that's evident here in all of these artists. You've got people from Philly that I've mentioned: Jill Scott, The Roots, Music Soul Child, Bilal, James Poyser, the Soulquarians, and also in his own right. And then later on, I'll mention a guy named Amos Lee, also from Philly. And there are two things you can feel if you're from Philly. You get a sense, you're listening to music and saying, wait a second, I hear a connection there. And one is, yes, that soulfulness, because there are artists who don't even do soul music who are from Philly who have some element of that soulfulness. And the second thing is something I mentioned when I was talking about G Love in that episode, and that is that Philly is a crossroads in a lot of ways. It's not just a hotbed of certain genres, but it's a crossroads for a lot of genres. And so a lot of music that comes out of there is an amalgam. I mean, 100% REC, you know, my music is an amalgam. There's no question about it. And so many of the bands that I've listened to from Philly from the very beginning, and even before, you know, I was old enough and before I was born, have that same sense of amalgam to them, where crossing lines is a good thing. Coming together is a good thing. You think what does Philadelphia mean? City of brotherly love. The idea of bonding and, you know, coming together in a way that creates something new, right? And that's evident in so much of Philly soul in general, Philly soul. And the other thing, and I'm just going to mention this real quick because this comes at around the same time, I was heavily into, you know, neo souls. You can see all the CDs I have, and there were several that I had that I ended up selling or actually donating when I was, you know, culling the herd to move. There were others that I wish some I wish I still had, but in general, quite a collection. I was putting out an album. It would be my last album under my own name, or the name Nick, you know, which was my performance name for a few years there, about a decade. And you can see on the cover, it's the Metro Grand Sessions from '02, the influence that soul music had. And you know, there's a lot of brown and orange and darker red hues. There's a little bit of shine in there, but this design that I created, which let me see if I can do it without that glare. All right. was 100% influenced by like Stevie Wonder covers and people like that, and certainly neo soul covers. And you look at some of these covers that have that similar hue, and sorry, you listeners, I'll name them so you can look them up. But D'Angelo's Voodoo has a brownish red. You've got, of course, Mama's Gun, Erykah Badu, which has the, green, red, orange. Lauryn Hill has that muted brown. MxG has a reddish and a brownish. Which one is this? Which album is this? It's, Just Listen. Just Listen. This doesn't. That's, a white cover, but you get the Headphone Masterpiece, somewhat of a brownness there, and you can't. The Roots do their own thing. So, but that just to me, like visually, is something that I've always associated with that, and something that I've always loved. That really, because it's connected so much with the feeling of the music, there is a warmth and a depth there, and that comes out in the in the artwork. And like I said, there's a huge hip hop contingent that, worked with neo soul artists and were considered in some ways themselves neo soul artists, and certainly influenced neo soul and even pre neo soul, as I mentioned. And I mean, you've got one of my favorite artists, Yassine Bey, who was known, previously as Mos Def, who worked with Talib Kweli and Black Star. Yes, they were called Black Star before Bowie's album Black Star. And then, yes, the Roots, as I mentioned, I believe, want to say West Coast band, Blackalicious, have certain qualities of neo soul in them. You've got, and to me, they are like the extension of De La Soul and A Tribe Called Quest. Like if they had still been, putting out commercially successful stuff in the late 90s or, early mid O's, they would be like Blackalicious. To me, that's how I feel. And then, of course, you can't go far without mentioning the Fugees and all the solo albums that stemmed from the Fugees, and Common, huge part of this entire movement. So many of these artists work with each other. And when I get into even the second kind of wave of neo soul, you'll hear a lot of that too. But like I said, you had Questlove working with D'Angelo, who Questlove and the Roots working with Jill Scott, and just on, just kind of this, folding over and the Soulquarian, connection and all of the common ground and collaboration. And let me go back and say again, because there's a couple of other albums here that I think are worth mentioning. Voodoo, D'Angelo is artistically the pinnacle, but you could make a case that other albums are also considered right up there at the top. And the ones I have seen most mentioned are Erykah Badu's Baduism, Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, again, and Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite. Of all of these artists, Maxwell's one that I don't know really much about. I didn't never really listen to, but I will say, although he did take a break at some point, he's really, of all of these artists, the only one who kind of continued in any kind of consistent way. There was apparently a lot of shifting and burnout that happened, and we're going to talk about that. I'd even put Jill Scott's 2000 album in there. I think it was called Who Is Jill Scott or something like that. That's an album I used to have on CD. I think that should be in the mix. As if you were going to mention five, mention Voodoo, Baduism, Miseducation, Urban Hang Suite, and Who Is Jill Scott. I think that was an album that really helped define certain facets of neo soul that were not necessarily present in some of the other artists. There was a poetry there, in very deliberate poetry, I think is a way to say it. So, we talked about how if you want to say, and I think it was 95 was when Brown Sugar by D'Angelo came out. We talked about how that was ostensibly the start of neo soul. In a lot of ways, by 02, 04, the movement had just completely burnt out. And it seemed to, I wouldn't say it exploded, but it seemed to have imploded in a lot of ways. And it was done in, to me, by a couple of things. First of all, you have to give credit to the artists who were starting to be defined, again, by genre. And that kind of rigidity and confinement is anathema to almost all artists. There are certain artists who actually like that. They prefer it. They often do it to themselves, or they feel that the safety of, well, this is what we do it best, let's just keep doing this. But so many artists, and I would say even the majority, prefer to not have walls built around that they didn't build themselves. And so when you get, as always, the record industry and the media, and then eventually crowds and fans starting to hear this buzzword, and it's something that I can't stand, of neo soul, and then saying, well, neo soul is this and that's all it is, and anything that goes a little too far to the left or right is not neo soul. That just feels horrible to an artist. And it's one of the things that actually kills a movement and kills a genre or subgenre, and is, I guess, it moves music into the future, is that if it doesn't have room to grow and breathe, it's just going to wither and die. It's going to suffocate. And that's why I get that idea of implosion. And there's a song that was originally on Cody Chestnut's headphone masterpiece. Of course, it's near the bottom of this freaking pile. And it's right here, called The Seed. And the Roots did it on an album in 2004, I want to say, and they redid it, called The Seed 2.0, and Cody Chestnut's on there, but they redid it, and Black Thought had, it's the superior version. And people have interpreted those lyrics in many different ways, and I mentioned this a little bit in the Roots episode, but what they were really saying to most, listeners and interpreters' ears is that you've got, rock and, rhythm and blues and country mixing and creating rock and roll. But then there was this sense of, one type of music seeds another type of music and outgrows a third type of music. And there's certain lyrics in there that talk about how either artists, or primarily, again, the same kind of triple threat of the record industry, the media, and rigid fans, let's say, saying that it could only be X or Y, and they were pushing against this. And if you're already pushing against it after something's only been around for a few years, that there is some kind of conflict inherent in what's going on. And that kind of, death knell, you can hear it for genres way before the genre peters out. You can hear it in certain people's lyrics. You can hear it in the way certain artists produce music. I mean, when you get artists like Prince or David Bowie, who were deliberately pushing boundaries all the time, as if to say, you will never, ever put me in a box, no matter how hard you try, then they rise above in a way that a lot of artists can't. Some will shift into something completely different, and then some, they just burn out. They can't take the pressure. They don't know what to do next. I don't really, I don't want to get into why certain artists just stop producing music. And there's so many. I mean, shoot. You can even say that happened to Sly at a certain point, although it took a lot longer. But you've got artists like, D'Angelo, who puts out this album Voodoo and then doesn't put another album out for well over a decade. And even for a while stopped performing. The famous or infamous, Lauryn Hill going through the issues she did, just having that spotlight thrust on her for such an incredible masterpiece. And then, I guess, for whatever reason, retreated from that, certainly popped up in various ways. But in the manner in which she has popped up, it is clear that one of the intentions is to say, I'm doing what I'm doing, and I don't care how anybody else defines it. And that's bold, and you wish and I wish, To me, when I do my sub-series, Death is Dumb, part of the reason why I say it's dumb, or however you want to phrase it, is because a person's actual death robs us of what they would have created had they continued to live. And I have been lately saying, for so many reasons, X is a gift, Y is a gift, because you've got artists who continue on past the point when they need to even, and are still creating great stuff and, giving the world something. Completely unrelated example, Hulu's got History of the World Part 2, run and started by Mel Brooks, who's 96 years old as of this recording and is still actively doing great stuff. That doesn't need to exist, but because it does to me, that's a gift. So somebody dies, those gifts are gone. I think in a similar, slightly lesser way, that happens when people stop creating new music. Whether you're talking about acts who become tributes of themselves, who for some reason lose the thread. I always mention Chicago and how they started to go to a place where even if they put something new out, it just barely feels like it has a connection to the vibrancy and spark that they had, especially in the 70s and even to some degree in the 80s. Or Billy Joel is a huge one who just, early 90s come along, mid 90s, and he's like, I'm done. I'm going to perform probably till I die, but I don't have any intention of putting out new music, even though I believe he's still creating new music. And that's, to me, is a death of a sort, because I guarantee you, whatever it is that he decides, I'm going to put this out, people are going to devour and be like, oh my God, that's Billy Joel. Like anytime older bands like U2 or The Cure, or up until his death, Prince, or up until MCA's death, the Beastie Boys, would put out a new album after even a few years break sometimes. I mean, not Prince, he never took a break, but I'm eagerly awaiting the next U2 album, the next Cure album, even the Chili Peppers putting out albums last year, bands who could just simply live wherever they want to live and do nothing, or just perform their old stuff. But it's this excitement of, oh, wow, these artists are still trying to do something new. They're not the, I keep going to my go-tos, but they're not the Beach Boys, who at a certain point just gave up putting out new music for whatever reason. I mean, Brian Wilson maybe not as much, but you get what I'm saying. And so when you have, Badu and D'Angelo and Lauryn Hill just saying, I'm done, I can't take this anymore, it really almost, they were such a presence at that time that it sucked a whole hell of a lot out of the universe when they disappeared. And so when, D'Angelo puts out his new album a few years ago, or a single recently, or when he did that tribute live, Sometimes It Snows in April, for when Prince died, you again feel like, oh, the presence has returned. It is a gift being given. It's a taste, at least, and unfortunately, none of these artists have come back as fully as they once were. No, I don't mean artistically, but I mean in terms of just attacking the world and consuming it, and us being consumed by what they do. There are artists who every time they put something out, that's how you feel, and you want that more from this. And it's sad that the pressure to conform to something that was just a few years ago, a new version of things that had come before that were currently existing. It sucks that it was kind of killed in the way it was killed so quickly. And part of that is because some of these artists were so exploratory that they began to shift away from the charts. And while I think artistically and personally, that's a wonderful thing, if you're a part of the industry or trying to make a living and or helping to support other musicians and crew and other people who are working for you and with you, and the money starts to dry up, it's hard to continue. It sucks that has to be such a big part of it, but unless you've reached a certain threshold where it doesn't matter what you do, you will always make money. Like like a Paul McCartney or a U2 or any of the people who are just now legends still continuing. Unless you reach that point, there's a point at which if you don't have some kind of steady income coming from whatever it is, you can't continue to do what you do in the way that you did it. So that's part of the reason why this happened. But again, a lot of the reason was the pressure. And I say that the idea of them shifting away from the charts on purpose, because it's dawning on me as I look at this next section that I'm getting to, which is the rest of my subtitle. Old, meaning 70s, got new, meaning neo-soul in the 90s, got old, meaning it died out too quickly, got now, meaning it never actually really died out. It just morphed. And what it morphed into was a newer version of pop soul. So if you think about certain soul songs from the 60s, a little bit in the 70s, big time in the 80s, a little bit in the 90s, there has always been a certain strain of soul music that has been more leaning towards the pop end of things than to the kind of, deeper, more exploratory sound, or that warm kind of inky sound if you listen to any single track off of D'Angelo's Voodoo, you will understand what I mean. Even the things that are popping in my head from like Lauryn Hill's main album, like that's same thing. You get that feel. That feel did not continue. That type of neo-soul did not continue, but its influence did continue on. You've got people who in the early O's started to do, again, a poppier form of neo-soul that at the time I think one of the reasons why I started to phase out myself, because I wasn't quite as into it, but I wouldn't necessarily even have qualified it, or as that, have classified it as neo-soul. So that's why I say it's a second wave. And that's people like, boom, John Legend, who, yes, also worked with The Roots, one of my favorite albums from like 10 years ago or so. Alicia Keys, big time. CeeLo, who had been around for so long, starts doing this kind of poppier, neo-soul, like there's traditional elements in what CeeLo did at the time. Anthony Hamilton. You can even mention Amy Winehouse and people like that who had such an element of that old school to them, but not in the way that first wave of neo-soul did. There was some changes happening there. I'm going to mention this guy who was actually just on Colbert because his star didn't really start to shine as bright until recently, which, hey, I don't care. The world is the way it is. Artists are who they are. And sometimes those two things don't meet up, timing and all of that. Is Robert Glasper, who is a jazz artist, but who has so much of that neo-soul feel. And he started I believe in the early O's. So he's sort of second wave, but sort of, to me, even next wave and beyond. And that next wave would include people like Frank Ocean, like huge Frank Ocean. I've got to say Kendrick Lamar. And again, you see that hip hop connection, but you're talking about somebody whose production style incorporates, again, soul and hip hop, funk and jazz and all of this stuff that you heard back in the mid-late 90s and early O's, back even in the late 80s and early 90s with the Tribe Called Quest and all that, where it was just that amalgam of styles that didn't rely super heavily on electronics. And I'm a huge electronica fan. It's not a judgment call. It's just a difference in style. So Frank Ocean and Kendrick, Esperanza Spalding, Amos Lee, again, somebody else from Philly, that Philly connection. Fitz and the Tantrums, Nathaniel Rateliff and the Night Sweats. I don't know if I, pronounced his name correctly, but you're getting a different feel of soul. There's a band that just popped into my head that I wish I had written them down, who've had some hits, who've been on TV, who've had their songs in movies and television, who have, again, that kind of warm soul feel. And here's where what I think started to happen. You had those early mid-O's people who were poppier, who many of whom are still continuing on, especially like a big time being John Legend. who had that certain feel of, it wasn't that down, deep, low, quality. I mean, Amy Winehouse had a bit of that, but with more of a rock edge. Then you had people coming in the next wave who took off from that kind of pop second wave neo soul and started to add in grittiness with like an Amos Lee or a Fitz and even Esperanza Spalding, even Kendrick Lamar. There's a grittiness that was coming back, but not in the way that it had existed. I wouldn't call neo soul gritty. I'd call it, gutsy and just, all the other things I mentioned. But that kind of grit, that more leaning in more towards the blues, but still soul, to me was that third wave. And then the later surge, right up until today, which is, again, old got, new got, old got, now, Flowetry, Anderson .Paak, and I've got to mention Silk Sonic, this is collaboration with Bruno Mars, which is like a very, very deliberate retro throwback. But again, I'll classify these in a little bit, but you get that sense that it is different from what came before. Ari Lennox, Her, big time. Moses Sumney, Thundercat. You got a little bit of that with Childish Gambino, again, hip hop, Giveon, big time. Mahalia, Steve Lacy, Arlo Parks. And here is, I think, where some of the most creative stuff, free of boundaries, has emerged from the influence of neo soul. Meaning this, when I talked about, my decade slam, my 100-year decade slam, and how every, genre had its peak decade, often the peak of a certain genre would actually come just after it was hugely popular, or during a comeback or whatever you want to say. So, to me, I can't remember everything that I said in that episode, but look back in that episode and you'll hear me say like, oh, it was more commercially successful in X decade, but then when this decade came is when it really started to explore itself, and it still had that elements of the commerciality, but really let itself go in so many other ways. And to me, that's where a lot of the neo, whatever soul, this fourth wave, is now, as is so much music now, because as the internet started to have the influence it did, where people just started to, listeners in particular, are very much, to me, no longer part of that triple threat in a big way. Older ones, maybe, I've heard people, trash certain artists for ridiculous reasons. But in general, you've got the music industry, you've got the media who are still heavily into classification, and we understand the expedience of that, but we understand the problems there and the restrictions. Listeners in general aren't doing that much anymore, especially listeners who grew up on the internet. And so artists who grew up on the internet, or who at least were aware of it as it was growing, are doing the same thing, are not feeling that confinement. So all the artists I just mentioned in this later surge really, to me, qualify as that. And I would include even in some of the previous surge, like Kendrick Lamar, of course, Esperanza Spalding, and yes, Frank Ocean. There's just so many of those people. And that, to me, is why, in some ways, as much as I still prefer that late 90s, early O's feel, because it was new to me then, and it was somehow, even though you knew what it was pulling from, it still felt super fresh, and certainly a welcome change from the stuff that came before. I think, objectively speaking, more great neo whatever soul is being made now than even was made then. And that a lot of modern pop, and if you go back to my episode on soft music, a lot of that soft pop, whoever it's come from, even if it's not strictly soul or neo soul, you can hear that influence hugely. I mean, listen to some of what Harry Styles does, some of what, MxG does, and people like that. Japanese Breakfast, just all these, you can hear elements of it that I don't think they wouldn't have been there had neo soul not paved the way, which of course means had soul and hip hop not paved the way for that. But, that's where everything is connected. Music is not a genre. There's almost no contemporary R&B, soul, funk, or pop tinged with all of those that doesn't owe a debt to neo soul. And I'm glad to see, again, some artists like John Legend and to a certain degree Maxwell and others continuing on. Jill Scott did not, I wouldn't say she didn't burn out. She moved into acting. She moved into all these other things. And I, remember seeing her on one of the, I don't know, I think it was Black Lightning. She was playing a villain there, and it was great to see her. Again, wish all these people were still making music in a consistent way. And I don't get to see a lot of live music, so I'm sure if I did, you guys, out there who see them might be saying, well, they're out there. They're just not putting out records. Put a record out, That's the way it reaches more people and it connects more people. Which brings me, of course, to, the spotlight song for this episode. And that is a song that was originally on REC's album, Syncopy for the Werid. If you give me a second, if I don't knock something down or hit this microphone, I will pull it out. Here's the Werid objective, and I'm also going to pull this one out. It's good to have this wall in the back, the wall of love. There it is. That's the Werid objective. So Syncopy for the Werid, which was the 4th album in that series from 2020, is a song called Make Me Break Like Every Day. And it was also featured on the recent album, recently released RECcollection, the Best of REC 2007 to 2020. I put the link in. Please listen to it. You'll also hear it at the end of this episode, as always. And the reason I chose this is I've had, again, elements of soul and funk and jazz and all of the things that influence neo soul in my music from the very beginning. Have not leaned heavily into it all that much, but Syncopy for the Werid does. There's another song called Love in Stockholm that kind of leans in that kind of experimental soul funk direction. But Make Me Break Like Every Day has almost all of the elements of neo soul. It's more electronic, but it has a warmness to it. The harmonies have a warmth to them, and the vocals lean more towards the down, lower register direction. There's not a tremendous amount of wailing or anything like that. The production itself is very warm. So there's just a huge influence of those low-end harmonic clusters, like I said. And I do those in such large part because of D'Angelo. And at the same time, there is, the content of Make Me Break Like Every Day in general is just sexual, frankly, and relationship based. But there's also an element of existentialism, an element of, kind of consciousness and depth in there. When I talk about the deeper we go, the higher we fly. Yes, that is a quote from a Beatles song called Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. But done in a very different way, and it was deliberately done as a quote and deliberately done differently to illustrate a certain different quality to the meaning of those lyrics and how they intertwine with the rest of the song. And you can hear experimental elements throughout, especially, and they pop out quite a bit in the end. If you take a listen to it, I almost always do a track on many of the things I do that is just experimental. A lot of it gets trashed, but there are certain little pieces of it that end up in there, because they work, they add a certain quality. And like I said, I'm from Philly, so it's kind of hard for me not to have some element of this in my music. So please, in the next 30 seconds or so, stick around, listen to that song, go find it on anywhere you stream, click the link to the Bandcamp page, add it to your playlists. Anything you can do to help support REC. Were you a neo soul fan when all of this came out? If so, who were some of your favorite artists? Were there artists I missed that you're like, how could you not mention this artist? Or artists you didn't like, or artists I mentioned, you say, yes, of course, Erykah Badu or whoever. Do you think it burned out because it got too purist, or the people listening to it and marketing it got too purist about it? Or is it that the world had moved on, or is it some combination of all those things? Or do you think it didn't burn out at all, that some of the artists might have burned out, but the genre itself continued on and morphed into the next wave? People that I mentioned, I want to hear all of your opinions and thoughts on all of this, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. thank you for listening and watching, and I'll talk to you next week.
Come on. Come on. You coming, set my body humming. I wanna take you every day, make me break like every day. Telling you the story, how you make me more me. Wanna taste you every day, make me break like